Good morning, I'm Lana Abbott, and I'm here to share with you today a devotion, and I'm going to talk to you today about faith over fear. My text passage today is from Matthew 14, verses 22 through 32. So it's a little bit long, so bear with me as I read through this story. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before them to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked in the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. So here's the setting of our story. Peter and the disciples are all in the boat, and they're all part of the same storm. And every one of them, it says, was experiencing fear in that moment. So in the middle of this storm, they see someone walking on the water, and they figure out when Jesus says, "It is him, do not be afraid," that it must be Jesus out there. But they were reacting out of fear. But only Peter, in recognizing that there was an answer to his fear, and the answer was as close as Jesus was to him. So Peter, ever bold, asks the Lord, "If it's you, tell me to come." And the Lord replies, "Peter, just get out of the boat." And Peter begins to walk on water. Now at this point, I'm sure the other disciples were talking amongst themselves and saying, "Look, he's walking on the water. He's crazy. Peter, look what you're doing." And Peter's focus in that moment goes off Jesus, and he looks around and he realizes he's in the middle of a storm. He realizes he's walking on water, and that fear begins to envelop him again, and he begins to sink. But recognizing where he is and who is in front of him, his first reaction is, "Lord, save me." And the verse says, immediately Jesus catches him. Peter had a lot of choices in these moments, but we only have this story because Peter, in this moment, chose faith over fear. He's not afraid to admit he's afraid, and his actions, even though they make him look silly in front of the other disciples, he doesn't go all macho and stay in the boat, but he ignores those base human instincts and instead makes his trip towards Jesus. He looks at a situation and says, "My answer is right there in front of me, and I'd rather humble myself and feel safe right next to Jesus." Peter in this moment is not afraid to admit that he's afraid. So often things are broken a little bit, and we continue to use them. We have a bowl that has a small crack in it, but we don't really think about repairing that small crack until all of a sudden the bowl's in pieces and we can't use it anymore. So we don't stop to repair things when they have little cracks, a little bit of brokenness, but we wait until they're shattered and destroyed before we think, maybe if I'd fixed that crack to begin with, I could have fixed the bowl and saved the bowl. And the same is true with our spirit, our humanity. We recognize sometimes that pieces in ourself, it's out of place. Things just aren't fitting right. And small cracks have developed, but we're too busy and we're too much in a rush to stop and repair the little cracks in ourselves. We think, I've made it through a lot. This is just a little crack. This won't slow me down. This won't hold me back. I can keep going. Then one day we recognize that we are shattered and can't even find all the pieces, let alone try to figure out how to put it all back together. We are just like Peter. We're in our own little storm. The boat is rocking. We're afraid. And we sit and worry more about what others are going to think about us once the mask is lifted, more than going to the only one who can mend our brokenness. Let me tell you, Most of you don't hide it very well. Others recognize more than you do that you are hurt on the inside, because we have a hard time hiding our pain. Only when you admit you are broken do you have a chance to be healed. Let me share with you the story of the day that my life shattered. Life was good. We had a family of 3 children that God blessed us with after many years of infertility. We had recently moved into our brand new home. I had a good job, and we were pastoring a growing and thriving church. Everything was going well, except I had, in retrospect, begun to feel like I couldn't continue on. I'd begun to feel a heaviness settle into my spirit, but as always, when I felt stressed, I knew I'd get beyond it. I valued myself to be a strong, capable person. If I set my mind to something, I could certainly do it. It was a Sunday morning, and as I made breakfast and got ready for church, I just couldn't stop crying. I was so overwhelmed. My husband asked me if I needed to stay home, but being the good pastor's wife, I said, no, I'll be fine, because I had jobs to do. I had to play the organ, I was a Sunday school teacher, and I needed to be there. There was work for me to do. But even as I got to church, it was unusual. I just couldn't pull myself together. I sat in the front pew and I was sobbing. I couldn't just gather myself together. And ladies from my church began to recognize this and gather around me and pray for me. But I was so overcome. Service was literally about to begin, and one of my dear friends looked me in the eyes and asked me, "Are you all right?" And I gave that correct response, "I'm fine." But she noticed my eyes and my face were vacant of any emotion, and she told me I needed to go to the office with her. In the office, I could not pull it together, and after a little bit of consideration, she drove me home. I went straight to bed when I got home and cried until my family came home. I had no energy, no strength, and I was completely drained. My family returned from church, and my husband came in to check on me. He wanted me to respond to him, and as I laid in bed, I could hear him talking to me, but I could not will myself to sit up, to respond, to roll over. It was like I was in a cavern. In fact, later I described it as I felt like I was in the bottom of a well, and I couldn't even see any light at the top. Eventually, he did help me sit up and made me a cup of tea. He gave me the mug, and I said, "I can't hold that." So he helped me drink the tea. He described my face as blank, emotionless, and empty. And after a time, he became concerned that I had maybe had a stroke. So he called Telehealth Ontario, and after talking to the nurse online, she asked if she could call an ambulance, and I agreed. I was taken to the hospital that afternoon, and they did a thorough check of my heart, my head, my blood. Mental health came down, and finally determining that I was not in danger of self-harm, they sent me home with a sick note for a week off of work. Immediately, I recognized that I had broken. I had shattered, and I knew I would never find the pieces on my own to put myself back together. A couple days later, we made an appointment with our own doctor. We went into his office, and Dustin did most of the talking, which was unusual for us. I remember sitting on the table and seeing my doctor's face as he looked between Dustin and I, and the concern that he had when he would look at me. He prescribed me some medication and furthered my time at home for 3 more weeks. And after another evaluation, maybe I could return to work. I was evaluated many times in that time, and always the date was pushed back and back. My life in the beginning of these months consisted of crying and sleeping. I was so tired. I would wake up in the morning and only maybe an hour or so, and I'd be back in bed. Some nights I could make supper, many I couldn't. Life became very slow, and the weeks turned into 6 months of rest and healing. I did attend church on Sunday mornings initially, and my only job was literally to show up. I couldn't sing, I couldn't pray, and just being there amongst people was absolutely exhausting. Our church family just filled in my jobs, and they gave me the space and time I needed to heal. We didn't hide what was happening from our church people, and they became part of the process of my healing. I remember laying on the floor and crying, and the 23rd Psalm became my mantra. He was making me to lie down in green pastures. And even though I felt like I was in the valley of the shadow of death, I didn't fear the evil. He was restoring my soul. And I prayed this 23rd Psalm even on days when I didn't feel like anything good was happening. But slowly over time, I began to gather strength. I never doubted that this time was just a season. I never was afraid it was going to go on, but I realized that I needed to slow down and take care of myself in order to heal. The setbacks were becoming rarer, and I was learning to recognize the warning signs within myself that I had gone too far and I needed to step back and take rest. Then one day, after about 6 months of being home, I had this realization. I actually felt like myself again. I felt like Lana, and I recognized my personality inside of me. But I was a bit afraid that day to say that out loud, because what if I had another setback? What if, another day and I didn't feel the same? And I battled that in my mind about confessing that I felt like myself. But I realized that it was faith that needed to take place in that day. And I said to my family in the kitchen, I feel like myself today. I can actually recognize me inside of me. And it wasn't that day that the journey was completely over, but I believe the restoration was evident in my spirit. And I even posted on Facebook about my journey and how I actually felt like I was complete again. I later asked my doctor, is 6 months about the average time for someone to heal from a breakdown? He said only if a person acknowledges it and puts healing into action. He said, I often see people after 1 to 2 years, later after a breakdown, by the time they've lost their jobs, their families, their homes, they've lost completely everything because they didn't stop in the moment and take care of themselves. So I tell you this today, I share this story to let you know that you are not alone. There is hope. There's a healing beyond your brokenness, but you have to first admit that you're going under. You have to be willing to let the world know, and don't let pride or position get in the way. Don't create a false front of who you are. Only when you admit you are broken do you have a chance to be healed. Today you may need mental, physical, financial, or spiritual healing, but whatever storm you find yourself in today, you need to look out of that boat and can you see Jesus walking towards you? Because he's so willing to rescue you if you just take that step of faith. In the last verse from our text, and immediately, there wasn't a wait there, immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. When you bring the master of the storm in your situation, only then can you begin to heal your brokenness. Jesus got into the boat and brought peace and healing to a very scary situation. Today, you need to take that step of faith over fear and allow the master to get into your boat. Thank you for joining us today.